Welcome back, America. It's Hugh Hewitt. The Republicans gathered in Orlando. I don't know if they're still there. I don't know where Representative Mike Gallagher is, but the chairman of the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party in the United States joins me from somewhere. Where are you today, Congressman?
I'm back in Wisconsin after being in Orlando. I'm in my basement.
All right. There are no Wisconsin teams left in the Sweet 16.
Well, hey, my Princeton Tigers, though, are
I was
Cinderella
afraid you were going to
story.
say that. That is, you just DQ'd yourself in front of the whole audience by bringing up the Princeton Tigers.
As you know, the Princeton's a massive sports school. Everybody's rabid about sports at Princeton. I often went to sports games and tailgated. So, of course, I've been rooting for them this whole time, Hugh.
Well, I'm glad that you've got a rooting interest because you haven't got any Wisconsin teams. I want the audience to know that after the Cavaliers upset the Bucks in the NBA Finals this year, Congressman Gallagher will be boycotting me. Let's get to serious stuff. Xi and Putin are in Moscow. It reminded me, and I tweeted out last night, the picture of Hitler and Mussolini meeting in 1936. It led to the Pact of Steel in 1938. And we have our friend Jerry Hendrick's essay in The Atlantic talking about what Russia and China could do if they decided to challenge freedom of the seas. What did you make of the essay? What do you make of the threat?
Well, first on the essay, I thought it was fantastic. It's a must-read essay for anyone who cares about national security. And Jerry makes some core points that I think your listeners will be familiar with, but need to be said to a wider audience. One, command of the seas is a bit like oxygen. You don't really appreciate it until it disappears, and then you really wish you'd invested in maintaining it. Two, we need something akin to a SHIPS Act that's just as aggressive, if not more, than the CHIPS Act that was just passed. And we really overall just need to have a sea power centric strategy to guide our Department of Defense efforts. We just played a war game that I led at the Republican conference. We did it on the first night. It framed a lot of the discussion. We had Admiral Mark Montgomery, as well as Ben Jensen, an expert wargamer from Marine Corps University, guiding us. We played various roles. Obviously, you can't do a true war game in 90 minutes, but we had the various chairmen as Secretary of Defense, as ODNI, as Secretary of the Treasury. And I think it was illuminating for our members to see just how dire the situation is, how quickly we run out of ammo, and how much of a strategic liability our inability to rebuild the Navy is. And Jerry's essay, I think, captures that better than anything I've read in recent years. And so my hope is that our members, the Republican side, took away from that war game a sense that there are meaningful things we can do this Congress to, if not rebuild the Navy over the course of the 2 years, because we can't do that, start to replenish our stockpile of key munition system, like the long-range anti-ship missile, like JASM and other SM-6 and other key missile systems. It was a very eye-opening experience, especially, I think, for those members who don't serve on national security committees.
Yeah, Congressman Gallagher, I did a 90-minute war game for AEI once at their retreat at Sea Pine Island, and I was the Vice President of the United States, which meant I had nothing to do. And so I just sat around and watched them do it. What was the scenario that you played for 90 minutes?
It was the Chinese made a kinetic move on Taiwan in an attempt to establish a lodgment. Quickly, though, so they chose not to do a blockade or take one of the outlying islands to try to go for Taiwan itself. We had 30 days of indications and warnings, so we were able to kind of track that this was coming. I'm not sure we'd have that in a real scenario, but because the Secretary of Defense recommended, and in this case it was Chairman Mike Rogers of the Armed Services Committee, to aggressively start sinking Chinese ships and planes early on in the crisis, which, by the way, until Americans are dying in a crisis, I question the ability of this commander-in-chief to take aggressive action. We were able to blunt a lot of the initial invasion, but even then we lost tens of thousands of Americans. And though the Chinese suffered catastrophic losses, they still had hundreds and hundreds of ships in the fight because they have the biggest Navy in the world. And oh, by the way,
did the war gamers hit the carriers?
They did, yes, on both sides.
Did the carriers survive?
Carriers and American carriers. At least one of our carriers was sunk, and another one was just kept out of the weapons engagement zone by a lot of the missile systems that the PLA rocket force has been using. Interestingly enough, earlier in the day, I went to a Lockheed Martin facility where they build one of these long-range missiles. And, Mark Montgomery did a fantastic job at the end. They modeled out the 36 different scenarios that would occur depending on what choices the players make. And there were consistent themes across the scenarios where if you invest in certain standoff missiles, long-range strike systems, you can actually start to make this problem much, much harder for the PLA planners, the Chinese military planners. The second thing is, if you invest in interoperability with your allies early on, the Japanese, the Australians, the Philippines, and though not a formal ally, are partners in Taiwan itself. If you figure out the basic warfighting structure, if you start to fight together and not make it up on the fly, things really start to become problematic for the Chinese. So there's some obvious things we can do over the next 2 years to start to get this thing moving in the right direction. But we don't have a sense of urgency for all the reasons that Dr. Hendricks laid out.
Now, Admiral Gilday was on 60 Minutes on Sunday night, and he was decrying our lack of capacity to maintain or build ships. Dr. Hendricks in the essay in The Atlantic says we're down to, a dozen gravettes, the kind of piers that you need to build ships. Did anyone discuss that? And will you be holding a hearing for the Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party on the People's Liberation Army Navy? Because their extraordinary expansion brings to mind what the Kaiser did prior to World War I, and the teaming up of Putin and Xi brings to mind the 30s.
It does. And, very quickly on Putin and Xi, because you asked at the outset, increasingly we just have to see these two problem sets as connected. I think it would be geopolitical malpractice to try and isolate the problem with Russia and Putin from the problem of Xi Jinping and communist China, because obviously they're involved in a no limits partnership, what I've called a new Cold War against us, and the collapse of deterrence in one theater affects the stability of deterrence in another theater. Yes, there was discussion about how we rebuild our Navy. Representative Whitman had the first question from the audience and talked about our inability after those first 7 days, because we only did one move. We did 7 days. We didn't finish the war. All right, well, now we got to move a bunch of stuff, men and materiel, from the continental United States into the Indo-Pacific. How are we going to do that? We don't have the ability to do that. As for the 60 Minutes piece, I was honored to participate with former Representative Elaine Luria, and I really think that 60 Minutes did a great job highlighting an issue that sometimes doesn't get highlighted outside our sea power circles. One thing I've disagreed with Admiral Gilday on is that he'll point to the shipbuilders, to the shipbuilding industrial base, and say, well, hey, you guys got workforce constraints, you got supply chain constraints, you're limited in terms of what you can do. Well, those companies will say to him, we don't have a demand signal coming from the Navy such that we could start to make multi-year investments in our workforce, in our supply chain, because for every ship we make, every tiny missile we make, there's some subcomponent that's produced by a mom and pop shop in somebody's district. And because there's no commercial market for these things, if that Navy budget seesaws, if it's not consistent, if it goes down, they're really in a bad situation. And that's, let me just go back and hammer one final thing, Hugh. That multi-year procurement authority, the ability to have a pot of money that transcends the budget fight every year, at least for key munitions and missile systems, is absolutely essential. For $10 billion or less, I believe we could seriously enhance our deterrent posture and prevent World War III, at least over the next couple of years.
Representative Gallagher, the only way to persuade the American people is layering. Now, 60 Minutes is a layer. Jerry Hendricks' book is a layer. Jerry Hendricks' essay is a layer. Every time I talk to you is another layer. But I would like to see your select committee focus on the PLAN, because driving home to Americans that they have vastly expanded their fleet faster than any fleet in history is an important point. And I don't know that Americans really understand just how big the Russian and Chinese threat is, particularly the latter on the blue water.
100%, we will be having hearings focused squarely on not just the military threat, but sort of the naval threat. We have a short-term opportunity here coming with President Xi's visit to the United States that we're hoping to do at least an event around to really hammer home the Chinese Communist Party's threat to Taiwan's freedom, as well as learn some lessons from how we defeated the Soviet Union that we could apply to the present day. So we're going to be digging into that. And as you know, our really sort of main mission is to explain to the American people why any of this matters, why they should care that we are ceding command of the seeds, to use Dr. Hendricks' phrase, to our enemies, and why, therefore, we in Congress should do something about it over the next 2 years. It's getting that sort of communication piece right that allows us to fuel our policy and legislative agenda. A lot of our early hearings, and we're hoping to finalize our whole year's plan here soon, are focused on the nature of the threat. We're trying to explain why this is such a threat, a clear and present danger to the American people. And then we're going to be transitioning into two things. One, I call the sprint, the things we can do in the 118th Congress, even though it's a divided Congress, to actually meaningfully improve our position. And then the long-term marathon, the things we need to do over the next 10 to 20 to 30 years to win the next century, to make sure we don't lose that long-term marathon or new Cold War or whatever your phrase of the moment is.
Last question. I know, because of you and Jerry Hendricks, Mark Montgomery, and I know he's a very passionate and persuasive fellow. Did he make a dent in the collective consciousness of the GOP caucus?
You know, I think so. And Mark would be great to come on and just brief. You know, I mentioned there was these consistent themes across all 36-ish scenarios that he modeled with Ben Jensen. That slide, I think, really captures, and Mark's sort of 5-minute presentation explaining that slide captures what we can do over the next 2 years. And again, I'm not talking about a massive increase of money. I'm talking about the dials that you could just turn that really have an impact in the Indo-Pacific, that I think even our friends that are a bit more isolationist minded could get behind. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about preventing a war. That's the goal. We don't want to, our goal is to deter a war. And Mark really captured that. And Mark, he's, in addition, has participated in so many of these war games and so many different fora that he just brings an expertise to the equation that few people have. And so I think we should get him on a bigger platform to talk about it.
I will have him back. I also have Jerry Hendricks coming up in hour 3. Congressman Mike Gallagher, you go, Princeton Tiger. Good luck. I didn't even bring up Aaron Rodgers leaving you in the dirt. I didn't even bring that up. Has Rodgers moved? Is the U-Haul left? Yeah, you missed that. He doesn't miss Wisconsin. It's the opposite of the opening of that 70s show. We love you, Wisconsin. Not anymore. Thank you, Representative Gallagher.